Okay, hello all primary PGCE students. My name's Julia Hope. I'm the head of the MA Children's Literature, and I also teach the Children's Literature specialism on the primary PGCE. This week, as you know, we're having a Children's Literature conference, and we're very lucky to kick off with a keynote speech from Professor Michael Rosen, who I think needs no introduction, who's going to give you a talk about the power of literature. Okay, thank you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Julia. I hope you can all hear me in this digital distance learning that we're doing these days. Just by way of an introduction, as I'm talking, if you've got a notebook by your side, if you like, challenge what I'm saying by thinking of exceptions or examples to illustrate the talk for yourselves, because you'll be able to think of all sorts of things, I'm sure. And given the title, The Power of Literature, some of it may sound a bit abstract and that I might not have time to illustrate everything. So there's a little job for you to do while I'm talking. So let's begin with that old perennial. What are we talking about when we talk about literature? Well, the traditional way is to talk about three pillars of literature. That's poetry, plays, and fiction. And you'll remember from your GCSEs and A-levels perhaps, that persists right from way back when, that idea. My own son at the moment, you know, he has poetry, though that's actually just dropped for this year. And of course, fiction has a particular piece of fiction, Jekyll and Hyde, and his plays, he's got Macbeth and an Inspector Calls. So there we are. You see, these three pillars, they still persist as the basic idea of what is literature. So you remember I challenged you at the beginning to think of exceptions that might possibly fall into that category. And these exceptions are quite important, particularly for your older children that you're teaching, year 5 and 6, because they're already have some investment in other forms of what we might call literature. So, for example, song. The writing of song lyrics surely is a branch of literature. So that would be a way of challenging my three pillars, if you like. And in fact, if you think more widely about one of the great traditions in the composing of what we might call literature, this is folk, traditional, anonymous literature, which includes song, myth, legend, folk tale, fairy tale. So it's a vast literature, but quite often gets excluded from what we mean by literature. So I'm all for wanting to include that, to bring it in. But also you may think, you know, that most of the children are watching TV and watching cinema. Well, somebody has to sit down and write scripts for that. Well, again, if I'm widening the umbrella, if I can put it like that, I'd want to include that. Yes, include the writing of scripts. And of course, this is very interesting for your children to be able to write scripts that they could then video and make their own little TV programs, if you like, little TV fictions or otherwise. And there may be some other areas that we might want to bring in. What about biography and autobiography? Or do we regard those as too true, to be too much like non-fiction to be included in literature? So there's a grey area for you. And also this business of writing essays or articles or speeches, that whole area of, you know, if you think of political speeches, articles in newspapers, are these literature or do we want a separate category for them? So I'm throwing that out for you, that when we're thinking of literature, we might be thinking of some or possibly all of these. And we don't have to take up cudgels and fight each other over it. But it's important to be thinking about this. So we can now ask the next question, which is, well, what have these aspects of literature got in common? Well, one word is the W word. These are written. And of course, this can be writing with pencil and paper or writing on computers. Or indeed, in some cases, improvising. So maybe not quite so written after all. But at the core of it is this idea of writing things down. But if we restrict it to, let's say, poetry, plays, fiction, and that area of song and traditional literature, folk, myth, legend, and fairy tale, Well, what have they got there? Well, what have they got in common? Well, one of the key aspects of it all is that it's not verifiable. So that's a pretty abstract way of putting it, but not verifiable. What do we mean by that? That's science, isn't it? The whole point about science is it rests on the idea that whatever you say, you should be able to verify it because you measure it and you test it and then you compare it. And then you say, yes, it is true that if I put X with Y, we get Z. Remember from our chemistry lessons or whatever. And of course, think of the vaccine at this very moment. It had to be verified to find out if it works. So that's the point about science. So the issue then with literature is that it can't really be verified. That isn't what it's about. It isn't about those processes. Instead, at the heart of it, we might say, is that there is something called figurative language. And this means, in little units, we mean things like metaphor and simile and symbol, indeed motifs of some kind or another. And these all represent things. So there's the idea in literature, sticking with the three pillars plus the song and the traditional forms, that these have all got at their heart a way of talking that doesn't simply mean what it sounds like it means. It's actually symbolizing or representing other things other than itself. So let's think of a famous picture book, like, for example, Dogger by Shirley Hughes, or if we want me to be self-referential for a moment and talk about we're going on a bear hunt, all right, we'll stick with either of those. Well, in Dogger, we might say that, yes, it is about that child losing that particular soft toy, but then it's also about, we might say, other things like loss in general or fear that I've lost something. And again, if we're going to take bear hunt, we might say, well, it's not really hunting a bear. So it represents something, and the lines, we can't go over it, we can't go under it, we've got to go through it, whichever order it's in. That's precisely what it's saying. It's saying that it's an obstacle in life that we're trying to overcome. So these things that we can point to in literature, if you've studied Macbeth, let's say, or King Lear, Hamlet, a lot of it, both at the level of language, but also in the scenes and the actions in the scenes and the outcomes, they represent other things. So there's a sort of representative thing, whereas flicking back to science, when we say that this vaccine works, it doesn't represent anything else, it is just the vaccine. So that might be something to focus on, the idea that everything in literature that we're looking at has got this dual quality, the thing that you're looking at, and then this wider stuff of what it represents, what it's symbolic of, if you like. And I will come back to that. Okay, so I've set up, if you like, what literature is and what might be a strong common element within it. Again, I invite you to think of other elements as well. So now let's get on to, well, what does literature do? Or to be more precise, what do we do when we read literature, or if we include film and TV, when we view it, when we see it, the moving image of fiction? So what does it do? And what do we do with it? So one of the first things that happens is that we are, in a way, we act as a companion. So more often than not, literature puts in front of us characters who might be beings, creatures, or of course human beings, or the animated landscape in some way or another. And one of the things that we do is we act as a companion to these characters. We might put ourselves in the shoes of that character, or we might, almost metaphorically, those characters might hold our hand. And so we go through the literature as it unfolds, being a companion. And this companion is quite specific because we aren't a real companion, we are an imaginary companion. We are the imaginary friend of the imagined characters in a book. That's the rather odd paradox that goes on. And this position as the kind of spectator companion actually means that we enact many acts of comparison. So we are the companion and we make comparisons. So we make comparisons with the self, with the person I am, make comparisons with other people. So it's the self and then the selves around me and the selves I know, like people in my family, friends, enemies, or whatever. And also I make comparisons with other texts, with other books. So this is a powerful motor at the heart of how we read. We're comparing what we read, if you like, with our own experience, and we're also comparing it with all the other stuff that we've read, all the other texts that we know. So this is crucial, these acts of comparison, because that's actually what we read with. We read with the identity and culture of the person you are, I am, and we read with the knowledge that we have of all those other texts. So rather than seeing a text as this thing that's full, and the reader, the child, or you, as a sort of empty vessel, and then this thing, the book, the story, the poem, the play, is poured into you. Rather, we should see it as this transaction, as some have described it, between the culture, the person, the individual, and the text. So there's a flow between the two. And this is very powerful. It enables us to discover things about ourselves. And my next point, to discover possibilities. So what these literary forms put in front of us are possible courses of action, if you like, possible ways of being. So if you think of the Gruffalo, then one way of being is to be scared of the Gruffalo. And we can compare what the mouse does, and we can compare with what I might do if I was faced with a Gruffalo, or indeed, if I want to be, I could be the Gruffalo and think about who I could scare. And then the mouse, of course, overcomes the Gruffalo. This is a standard theme, particularly in folk literature, of the little person overcoming the bigger one. You only have to think at the end of Puss in Boots, the way Puss in Boots overcomes the ogre at the end of Puss in Boots. So what fiction often does, and all books, is present us with possibilities for action. And going back to the compare idea, offers us a chance to compare what I might do if I was in those shoes with that person. Or if some exciting new world or new possibilities are put in front of us. If you remember A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Dickens portrays that character of Scrooge as someone who's in one place, gets to another place because he is in a way reformed. And so we see the possibility of reform, and we can ask ourselves, well, how has he reformed and why has he reformed? And we can ask those questions of ourselves. Am I a bit like the way Scrooge is at the beginning? And do I want to be more like the way Scrooge is at the end? So I start to see transforming aspects of myself. And if you take a book like A Christmas Carol, it was written also for the purpose of making a social comment, not just a personal comment about how somebody can be personally reformed, but should we be like Scrooge? So there's a common element that's raised there. So fiction has this social, some have called it utopian element, that enables us to think of possibilities of the way we might be, not just the way I might be. And we can also say about this form, this thing that's been invented, literature, is that it's very suggestive. In other words, going back to my comparison I was making with science, science can suggest things and then it sets about proving them and then making sure that they work and go on working. So I'm talking to you thanks to science because of all this digital stuff, because people thought about it, they wondered about it, and then they came up with something and verified it, and lo and behold, it's working. Fiction doesn't have to do that. It can just leave us with questions. It can just say, why did my mum not come that day? And leave it there. It doesn't have to answer that question. And a lot of fiction asks many more questions than it answers. So if we take one of the great big question bits of literature, Hamlet by Shakespeare, well, what does it solve? What does it answer? It poses a lot more questions than it answers. Why couldn't he, Hamlet, why couldn't he overcome the person he knows had murdered his father? Why does he squander the one love that it looks like he can be certain of, that of Ophelia? Why does he throw that away? And instead of there just being one answer to these questions, what's fascinating about literature is it gives us the possibility of 4, 5, 10, 20 answers. And they might all be equally valid, or we might be able to argue and say, well, this one's a bit more valid than that. But this is, again, one of the powerful things about literature, is that it offers us these possibilities and also makes suggestions which we ourselves can build on. That goes back to this idea of that it's an act of comparison. Yeah. And I've also touched on this. A further aspect is that literature quite often involves change. So it might be something that is just an observation of the change in landscape, leaves falling off trees, a clock, the arms or hands on a clock going round. Or it might be the change in a person, or it might be the change in action. So one way to think about literature is it's full of cogs that are turning. So there's a sense of movement going on inside literature all the time. And it's this that's pulling us through, because we want to know what happens next. We want to know what that person feels next. How will they react? How will the other person react? And so there is this sense of change going on. And there is a possibility that as we read and view that change, we change. So there is this idea that we're also a cog in getting enmeshed in the cogs that are in literature, if you like. So that's powerful. And then if we put on another hat now and think of literature as a cultural thing or a cultural process or part of a discourse of culture, that's to say, if we say, what is culture? And we might say that is a way of having a single word to describe the way we do things, the way we say things. So language is part of culture, haircuts are part of culture, clothing is part of culture, sexuality is part of culture. So literature, if we put it in this context, is a way of expressing ourselves according to cultural groups, according to ethnicities, according to class, according to layers within society. Have to be a bit careful about that we don't reduce it to simply saying, oh, this piece of literature is simply or only the mouthpiece of that ethnicity or that elite group, let's say. It may have originated that way, but I don't think we should ever put up barriers and say it's restricted to that. So again, if I might draw attention to my own offspring, they've been excited and enamored of songs and music and culture that is not their own. So they do that crossover thing and enjoy literatures that and songs and cultures that originate with other ethnicities other than their own other groups. So literature has that capability of showing us what is culture, expressing culture, all the different aspects, the language, the hairstyles, the sexuality, and the way they belong to groups, but also, of course, the way it can be intercultural. Now, this is very important. We know the word multicultural, but in a way that's slightly misleading, because multicultural suggests there are these chunks of culture that sit alongside each other, whereas in actual fact, the whole history of culture is that of sharing. This language I'm sharing with you, speaking, is a perfect example. I'm speaking to you in Germanic and Romance, in other words, the original, not totally original, but the people who migrated to Great Britain, they came from the areas of Germany, Saxony and that sort of thing, speaking a Germanic language. And then when the Normans arrived, they arrived with a Romance language, French, Norman French. And I'm speaking in a mixture of that, along with many other words taken from all over the world. As a result, partly of the way in which Britain occupied other parts of the world through the British Empire, but also through trade. And you can have wonderful fun looking at words and seeing how these are shared across cultures. So literature can express culture, but perhaps more accurately we say it expresses cultures, and that there are always hybrids and crossovers and sharings within it, even at the language level. And it's fantastic fun to explore these intercultural aspects of literature. Yeah. And it can also be a way for people to express their worth as cultural beings, that they have a sense of belonging, so that if we show a piece of literature to a class and somebody, if the word we use, identifies with that, saying, oh, that's to do with me because I am, and you can fill in the gap yourselves, I am this kind of a person, and I can see that person in the book. And so I feel I'm sharing that. But then it's quite exciting to see that it can be shared with everybody. So I work largely within the world of poetry. Poetry has been unbelievably enriched in this country, particularly by the influence of people of African Caribbean origin. You only have to think of people like Benjamin Zephaniah, John Agard, Grace Nichols, just as people of my generation, if you like, and they completely enriched and helped change poetry for children, partly through performance, partly through what they were writing about, how they perform. And so there would be an example of how poetry, one of the pillars, one of my 3 pillars that I mentioned, being changed and enriched and shared through, if you like, this awareness of culture and the way in which that's expressed. Also, from an educational point of view, literature is interesting and useful from, if you like, from a purely linguistic point of view. So we know that children are largely occupying an oral world, and part of our job as teacher educators is to take them through to the written world. And the great advantage of literature is that it offers us chunks of the written world, often in standard English, but not always, in dialogue and all sorts of other forms, and indeed in dialects, so in various forms of expression of language, and offers them in a portable form, a portable, memorable form. And this is another aspect of the power of literature, is that artists, writers, put in huge effort to make literature memorable. That's what we do. You know, obviously in poetry, you've got things like rhyme and rhythm and image and feeling and patterns of feeling that make things easy to remember. I wandered lonely as a cloud. So lonely and as a cloud become kind of memorable because it makes you wonder and think, is a cloud lonely? Really? Or is he lonely as a cloud? It's up on high. So we remember little phrases. Every one of you will remember a phrase or a moment from a book, from a play, a poem, or indeed from films and the rest. So it's memorable, and therefore it's giving children kind of blueprints. You know, when I learnt French at school and German, we were taught a lot through poems and songs. So when I learnt French, we were encouraged to learn chunks of the stuff so that we had blueprints for the language. Maître Corbeau sur un arbre perché. So there we are. Mr. Crow on a tree perched. That's to translate that literally. And that's in my head. So whenever I think of a crow or a fox or indeed perched on a tree, I've got that. I've got that in my head. And of course, that applies right the way across literature. It gives us these memorable things. And that's very important for the classroom. So coming to the classroom, we've mentioned sharing. And I want to just open with you finally this idea of interpretation. So I would argue that every reader is interpreting. The trouble is, in education, we've put up this great big institution that you can't interpret until we show you how to interpret. And I resist a bit of that. I know it's in the national curriculum and we're supposed to give the children the tools to interpret. But I would say take one step back from that and say, remember that every child who becomes engrossed with a book of any kind, a poem, a story, or a play, or whatever, a song, they are already interpreting. Because if you go back through my list of being companions and making comparisons, engaging with the possibilities and the suggestions, the sense of change, the sense of culture, all that the child is doing through comparing themselves with what's in the story and comparing it with other texts that they know. And believe me, they do know other texts, even if they might not be if you like, the prestige texts. They'll know other texts of one sort or another. So they're doing that, which means that we can create in a classroom some questions that, if you like, unlock the culture, the response of the child. This is part of what's called reader response theory. So we can ask questions, and you can refer to the work of Aidan Chambers in particular for this, or I've, if you like, shrunk down some of Aidan Chambers' work into some key questions, which is there anything in this text, in this story, that makes you think of something that happened in your life? Yeah? Or it's in the life of somebody you know. Are you touched or affected, or do you feel emotional about that in any way? What are your feelings? So you see, we're trying to get to the idea that the child has the experience with which to unlock the story, the book, whatever, yes? And we can also get to that thing about comparing it with other texts, because we can just say, does it remind you of anything else that you've read or seen on the telly, or a song you know? Which bit of that story that we're reading by Michael Morpurgo or Benjamin Zephaniah or whoever, and we can say, does it remind you of another story? Because at this, you're unlocking one of the secrets, if you like, of literature, is that it's a very scavenging form. It's borrowing, begging and borrowing from all sorts of other things. Let's take Harry Potter. I'm guessing we can share that. So if you say Harry Potter goes away to this school, this sort of strange kind of posh boarding school, do we know any other boarding school stories? Well, they're not terribly popular these days, but I mean, the whole of the late 19th century and early 20th century, children's reading was full of these posh boarding school stories. Some of you may remember the Enid Blyton one, Mallory Towers. I think that's a boarding school, isn't it? And some of you may know some others. Way back when, in the 1930s, 40s and 50s, there was a character called Billy Bunter that a lot of people read. I think J.K. Rowling knew plenty about those stories when she sat down. She didn't have much experience of boarding schools, let alone mixed boarding schools. So she begged and borrowed that, and then worked the characters within that. So when we say, can it compare? Yes, it does compare. And then what about this idea of the great magician who is cast out, if you like, but then gets discovered and might end up saving the world? Well, there's lots of examples of that. And you can go through books and find these connections. The posh word for it is intertextuality. But rather than imposing that on the children, we can actually ask them, what does this text remind you of? And they might find all sorts of comparisons that we hadn't thought of. But if they can justify it, then it exists. It is a link. You know, again, it's not science, this. This is a very fluid world of borrowing ideas from different texts. You know, if you take Shakespeare, he hardly made up a story in his life. So you take that great bunch of stories, the plays that are so famous, and you only have to look at the beginning of one of the kind of books we looked at when we did GCSEs, and you discover that he begged, borrowed, and stole the stories from somewhere else, because that's what literature does. And indeed, the very idea of tragedy and comedy was something that he borrowed. But of course, he did invent things as well. So when he created plays that we call the problem plays, this was something he invented. So I'm just giving an example of Shakespeare, not necessarily because you're doing lots of it, but of somebody who is rated and yet is, if we use a pejorative word, is a plagiarist. He nicks stuff from other people. Don't we all? So you can invite children to look for that with that question: what does it remind you of other things? And also, and maybe I'll finish here, is that all this thing that we're talking about, literature, is a powerful springboard for children to write and to express themselves. So what we can do with literature is say something quite simple. We can see a story, part of a play or a poem, and say, hey, we could do this, couldn't we? Then you can get the children discussing how they could write like the thing that they've just read. And it might be just a chapter or the opening of a book or an exciting moment in a book, or it might be a whole poem or a scene from a play. And you say, as an invitation to the children, we could write like that, couldn't we? We could write a scene where, I'm thinking of the Michael Morpurgo story when the two boys are waiting to be chosen after they've been evacuated, and they're the last children to be chosen. And that idea that somehow or other you've been rejected, and the two boys have a conversation, and you could say, wow, we could write like that. Or going back a bit, think of Tracy Beaker, who writes a profile of herself in order to make herself more likable or to be wanted by somebody coming to the foster home. And you can say, what would happen if you wrote something about yourself where you fibbed a bit and exaggerated and made yourself kind of seem a bit more special than you are? And then what if you wrote something alongside it that was really ruthless with yourself? So you can take these things as models, as springboards, platforms, triggers, whatever word you want to use. And literature keeps providing us with loads and loads of examples that children can imitate. And the watchword here is, watchwords, imitate and invent. So you can take what's there, imitate it, and invent your own forms. So you could take, I don't know, Little Red Riding Hood, Humpty Dumpty. You can take anything and just simply, just start changing the characters, changing the settings, changing a bit of the plot line. Playing is crucial here. So you imitate it, but within it, you invent it. And many of the films that we watch, in case you think you're doing something vaguely naughty or irreverent, an example I often give, The Martian, the Matt Damon film. Well, if you think, well, was that an original idea? Well, if you've ever read Robinson Crusoe, you'll find some big similarities between the two. I think some Hollywood folks sat about and went, hey, what if we updated Robinson Crusoe and stuck Robinson on Mars? What would happen then? And then they wrote a film. So that process we can reproduce in the classroom. And indeed, that is one of the great powers of literature. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was a really interesting talk, and I'm sure it's been very inspiring for our students. So I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you on behalf of everybody for the wonderful keynote speech you've just given. Okay, goodbye.
Thanks very much, Julia. Thank you, and goodbye, everybody.